in my opinion, the pyramid of the person that practices the methodology of CrossFit and the pyramid of a CrossFit competitor are not the same pyramid.
Interesting.
So the pyramid and the boxes are the same, right? Nutrition at the bottom.
I don't know how I found you, because I was researching for an episode with what's the name of the guy? David Sharanki.
Yeah.
From England. And I think you did a podcast with him, and it was with one other video, the only podcast on the web I could find. And I was watching it and I was like, oh, this guy's really good at podcasting. And then I was researching your profile, and then I saw that you're working with all the Frenchies, and I was like, this guy's interesting. I have to look at it. And since then, I don't know, I see this freaking zone 2 training everywhere on the gram. Like every athlete is posting about it. And maybe it's like, you know, when you want to buy a specific car, like,
yeah,
oh, I want to buy a red car, and you see all of a sudden you see
everywhere.
red cars everywhere.
Absolutely.
But what is this zone 2 thing?
It's just easy work that people didn't do before, and now they figured that they have to if they want to live until 50, and they can't run into walls every single day. I think it's just that, and it's nothing new, right? It's been around forever. You can read endurance books from the 60s, 70s, 80s. They talk about it. It's just it kind of, I think it's a combination of things. It's half a cultural thing, where in CrossFit especially, there is a very big bias towards high intensity, because that was part initially of the methodology, right? It was kind of a trade-off of you can work really hard and you don't have to work a lot. And that worked up until a point. But then when competitors started doing 2-3 sessions a day, training 15, 20, 25 hours a week, you just can't do that every session. So you naturally have to distribute your intensity differently. And the best work that you can do with high volumes, with virtually zero cost on your nervous system, metabolic system, is that low intensity stuff. And so I think that is one aspect. And the second aspect is that more overall kind of hit, if I can call it a trend over the last maybe 10, 20 years, where again, there's all those sprint interval training studies that came out and that showed that for the same amount of work, it was probably better to do it at high intensity. But then people forgot to contextualize those results. And, you know, when somebody says, yeah, but over 8 weeks, over a 8-week or 12-week study, we see that high intensity is better than low intensity training for an equal amount of work. My question to that is, how many cycles of 8 weeks or 12 weeks of sprint interval training can you do before you actually die? Because for anybody who's actually done those training sessions, they are not fun. They will make a grown man cry. And we have to think about that in the long term, because studies are 8 to 12 weeks, but a training plan over multiple years is not that short, and we can't just extrapolate from those short studies into a global training approach. And then just, you know, getting inspiration from and learning from endurance sports, endurance coaches, and how they function. Because at the end of the day, I mean, CrossFit today at a high level is an endurance sport, as in you have to be able to perform for multiple days in a row for, you know, 2 or 3 tests a day, for 3 to 4 to 5 tests a day, a week, days a week. And if you can't endure that amount of work, then you're probably not going to be as good on the last day as somebody who has more of that capacity. So that's kind of where I see it coming from, rightly or wrongly. So, but I think it's got to be at least part of the conversation. It's not a magic bullet. It's not the only thing that you need. High intensity is very important as well, but it's got to be part of the conversation.
Yeah, it's certainly not fun. Whenever I see popping up on main site or anywhere else, like 10 rounds of 100-meter sprint or 200-meter sprint, I'm like, oh, this is gonna hurt really bad.
Exactly.
It looks nice on paper, but it's not.
It's not. It's not.
Yeah, man, we're jumping right in. But where are you coming from? What's your background?
My background, I guess I played sports my whole life. When I was a kid, I did some soccer. I did a little bit of combat sports, I would say intermittently. So I never kind of stuck with it, but I did some judo, some karate, some kung fu with some friends. And then when I was 17, I started playing rugby. My brother had joined the team, the local team here in Switzerland, in the town that we live. It's called Nyon, on near Lake Geneva, or on the side of Lake Geneva, between Geneva and Lausanne, so pretty close to the French border as well. And joined the team, and I love to run. I could run a lot, and so it worked quite quickly. And I really enjoyed that. I played rugby for 5-6 years. Played with the Swiss junior team a couple of years in a row, which is nothing like joining, the French junior team or the German junior team or the English junior team, because I was in the team because I was playing rugby and I was the right age. That was pretty much that's how few people played rugby back then. So did that. After rugby, I played. No, I didn't play. I moved to CrossFit after that. So I did about 1.5 years of CrossFit. I took some classes when I was in Vancouver with Emily Beers. She'd gone to the games a couple of times back then. That was
old school.
Yeah, that was 12 years ago, 10, 12 years ago. And then from there, I used to practice CrossFit in my backyard. I bought a barbell, I bought some bumpers. I made a pull-up bar out of threaded pipe that I attached to the side of the house. Made a jump box myself. Made a mod kit to make it into a GHD as well. Like I built all those things, and I just trained on my own. Never competed in CrossFit, but then from CrossFit, I branched out into Olympic weightlifting, and I practiced that for a couple of years when I was in British Columbia, and did a few local competitions. Definitely, in hindsight, did it all wrong in terms of how I trained, and I wasn't sleeping enough. I was working a lot. We just had a kid with my wife. I wasn't doing anything but weightlifting, and that was definitely one of the reasons why I had a few injuries, and I probably didn't progress as much as I would have liked to or could have. From there, I went to indoor rowing and did about 1.5 years of that, and did a couple local competitions as well. And then from then, that's kind of the period where I switched to coaching, which is about 8 years ago now, 8-9 years ago. And I started personal training and small group training in Vancouver in a few different gyms, and then did some personal training in a little private studio with my own clients. Did that for 3 years, and then we moved back to Switzerland, which is where I'm from originally. So we're back now. What is it? 4.5 years we've been back in Switzerland, and since then, I did a little bit of strength and conditioning with the rugby team here and with the Swiss Rugby Academy, so the juniors. But for the last 2 years, I've been really focusing on all things conditioning, and I work with a broad range of athletes and sport enthusiasts, from amateur all the way to pros. I work in CrossFit. I work in sailing. I work in endurance sports, running, triathlon, cycling. I've worked with kayakers. I've worked with Nordic skiing folks. So essentially, my overall goal now is to try and bring endurance principles into the other sports in order to help people build that base, and then have the right infrastructure to tolerate more training, to recover better, to do more work. Because at the end of the day, we know that if all else is equal, the person that does more is usually going to be a little bit on top. But to work that much, you need to be able to recover. You need to be able to endure that volume. So that's kind of where I place myself today, helping coaches understand those principles and apply them with their athletes, and then helping athletes directly build that endurance and enable them to essentially do their work better.
Man, Switzerland is so interesting, I think. Like I had a lot of Swiss athletes on this podcast, and
Mm.
it's always fascinating me that this small tiny country is producing such high level athletes, like in all sorts of things. Like I know if you take tennis, for example, you have one of the greatest of all time,
Mm-hmm.
if not the greatest. But have you like started with conditioning, personal training from the start, or was it just brought everything you've learned over the time putting
No,
together?
yeah, I was definitely more kind of broad and general in the beginning and in the training that I was doing. I thought I had, and that's probably the reason. That is definitely the kind of a pivotal moment that drove me to kind of focus on what I'm specialized in now. It
Mhm.
was at the beginning of the pandemic, and I remember I hurt my back,
Interesting.
and I was stuck lying on the couch for a couple of weeks. Literally, it was hard to get up and move around. And I'd signed up for the Classroom, which is Training Think Tank's education platform.
Hmm.
And I watched Evan Pycon's presentation on bioenergetics, and that flipped my head upside down because I thought I understood conditioning, I thought I understood energy systems, and then what he was putting forward was essentially going against everything that I had learned, and he was backing it up with field measurements, actual data that made sense and that you could see clearly on the signal of the device that he was explaining. Um, Oxygen is being used from the first millisecond of any type of effort. And there is no, oh, aerobic system starts 2 or 3 minutes down the road or anything like that. So that kind of made me rethink everything that I thought I knew. And that's been kind of the inception, the beginning of me digging into that field of exercise physiology. And since then, I've been lucky enough, in big part through my podcast, interviewing experts, researchers, coaches, and try to just understand this whole thing better and make sense of it. I think one of the complexities of exercise physiology is that there's many different models that you can apply to human physiology and how we want to quantify it, whether we measure lactate, whether we use critical power, critical speed, whether we look at VO2 kinetics. I mean, there's different lenses you can use to observe the same phenomenon, and everybody's speaking their own language. And so when you come from the outside, nothing makes sense because some person saying, "Oh no, this is how you measure thresholds." The other person says thresholds don't exist. The other one says, "Oh no, you gotta measure, more performance metrics, and then you can calculate critical power, and that is the right way to demarcate between zones and intensities." So I got into this, and I like to understand. I like to understand the why. So what I've tried to do and what I've done over the last few years is kind of bring all those models together and try to see how they overlap. Because I find that that's probably the most fascinating part for me. It's not sticking to one philosophy or another or one model or another. It's looking at the in between, the Venn diagram and the
Mm.
intersection of those circles, and where does it overlap? Where does it all make sense together? Because obviously, if you can get to the same conclusion from a different starting point, that reinforces the strength of your hypothesis, let's say. So that's what I've been trying to do, is trying to kind of bring together all those different models, understand them from different perspectives, and then apply those principles to training, whether it's for athletes or coaches.
Different perspective is interesting. Do you think that CrossFit athletes, like on a professional level, are unique in that sense that they are willing to let coaching or I don't know how to say this. They are willing to get information from outside the CrossFit space. Like they're taking on like weightlifting coaches, conditioning coaches. Like, do you think that's unique, or have you seen this in other sports too? That there is that openness to.
I think CrossFit at its foundation was almost built to be open to those things. The idea was that you go see the experts in different sports and you bring it back to CrossFit, and you
Yeah.
try to bring it all together and make the best that you can. So I think the original model was built around that idea, which intrinsically makes it more likely that people are going to do that. And it has been the case for a long time now. Like you said, we see, weightlifting coaches, Coach Bergner and others have been in the space for a very long time. And you see gymnastics specialists coming to teach in CrossFit spaces now as well. And the conditioning is also following. There's Chris Hinshaw, there's Facundo, there's other people in the space that have more of an endurance background and come and bring those principles over. So I think it's not necessarily exclusive to elite CrossFitters, because everybody can benefit from those specialists at some point in their development or at some point of the year. There's, I think, and that's another thing we can probably talk about later on, but there's, what I see, maybe not at the elite level, but at the sub-elite level, what I see a lot is people training the same all year round. They're doing the same thing week in, week out. They're going really hard all the time. And they never really get out of CrossFit per se, of the tests, of the Metcons. That's not all they do, because they do their weightlifting, they do their gymnastics, they do a little bit of conditioning on the side, but there rarely is any time where they do something vastly different than the sport itself. And
do you think that's because they're going to a box, and the overall programming in a box is like for the general public, and it's to bring them into the CrossFit methodology and not like specifically for an athlete?
I think it's a double-edged sword, because when you begin CrossFit, you're going to go into that high intensity pretty quickly usually, and obviously it depends on the person programming, the person coaching, but usually you're going to get exposed to intensity pretty quickly. And I think it's great, because it's probably what's going to bring you the best results for time invested up front. It's definitely the quickest way to progress off the bat. And the analogy I like to use is that when you're a beginner, it's like, if we take a car analogy, I'm terrible with cars, but I think that one will work, and I can handle the analogy. It's the 2CV, the Citroen, the little cars, 2CV engine, tiny little engine. So that's a beginner, right? You can't hurt yourself. Even if you even if you floor it with a 2CV, you're not going anywhere. It's got 2 horsepower, right? And that's a beginner going hard. They're going hard, but really in the grand scheme of things, no, they're not going very, very hard, which is fine, but that enables them to progress. And then what happens in the progression is that you start with a little bit, you have a great effect, you have the endorphins, you have all the hormonal benefits of exercise, especially for people that were maybe sedentary before that didn't do anything. So this is great. You have the group aspect, so you have the community building aspect in the gym, and you're reinforcing those good habits. You're coming back, you're eating probably better, you're probably losing some weight. All this is great. And then, you start to plateau a little bit. So what do? You go a little harder and you do a little bit more, and it works, and for good reason, right? The sticking point that I see is once you get, say, you're flat out in third gear, and people think that, oh, okay, so now if I want to progress, I need to do the same as what I did before, which is do more and do harder. So instead of doing, 1 a day, I'll do 2 a days, and I'll go really hard twice a day. The problem with that is, again, you're at the end of your third gear, you're flat out, you can't go anywhere. You're revving all the way up at the max with your engine. What people need to do is shift gears. They need to shift into fourth gear. Means the RPMs have to come down, and that's kind of the transition that I see a lot of people not doing, usually because they don't know, right? They have that previous experience of, if I do more and do harder, it worked in the past, so it's probably going to work now again. But it only works until it doesn't, and then when it doesn't, you get injured, you plateau, you get burnt out. And unfortunately, I've seen people, athletes, go down that rabbit hole and come out with health injuries on the other side, health issues from a hormonal standpoint. And then we can talk about, all the culture around being lean, looking really good all the time, and the cost of this, especially for women. I think that's something that's maybe not talked about enough. So there's those two sides, right? There's some really positive sides to it, obviously, and I don't practice CrossFit today, but I'm obviously in the space every single day, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for people that practice the discipline, the methodology, or the sport, and people who coach it and work in it. But we have to be conscientious of that sticking point, that transition, and especially for people that want to be competitive, people that want to train hard, people that want to get better. It's a serious sport. You know, there's weightlifting, there's gymnastics, there's a lot of things, a lot of skills you have to learn. It's a very technical sport if you really think about it, because you're bringing in, you know, technical disciplines, multiple of them together, and you have to learn them all and be good at them and then organize it. So yeah, it's not a, I don't think it's a CrossFit specific problem. It's a mix of people wanting to be better, and they maybe don't know and don't understand what they actually need to do to get better at a certain point in their progression, and the overall culture of working hard, which obviously is very important. But there's a balance to find between working hard and then working as hard as you can all the time, because even though that's what, you know, people put out on Instagram, this is not how if you finish, let's put it that way, if you finish rolling on the floor after every single session, you're doing it wrong. Because maybe sometimes you want to go there, obviously in competition you definitely want to go there. This is when you want to put it all out on the line and just give it everything that you have. But you can't train like that every single day. Not and you know, people are going to come back and say, yeah, but I do and I'm fine. Yeah, you're fine for now, but could you win 5 or 10% in performance by training a little bit differently and organizing your intensities a little bit differently? I think you could, and from what I've seen, this is usually how it pans out. So this, I think it's just a balance to find, and maybe a little bit more development that needs to be implemented in the general, you know, programming and progression, especially when we go from that amateur to competitive aspirations.
Yeah, I think I've been there on a plateau level, because I think you explained it like beautifully. Like in a box, the coaches and the overall programming is focused on getting the people to the third gear, if you wanna say it like that. And after that, I think it's mainly on. I hope coaches are having that on their radar and like directing people once they're there in that direction. But I think it's mainly on you're mainly on your own, and that's really things. Yeah, and interesting from the application of other sports. Like I thought about it a little bit since you talked. Like it's at the top of the pyramid, you know. There's the sport, and yeah. But if you look at this pyramid, like endurance or cardiovascular endurance is on the, I think, the second floor.
Yeah, nutrition, metabolic conditioning,
yeah,
exactly. Gymnastics, weightlifting and throwing, and then sport at the top. And
yeah.
that's I'm glad you pointed out the pyramid. I think this is also a transition that happened in the CrossFit world, but that we didn't talk about. So it kind of went under the radar, and now we're in that situation where there's actually two different pyramids, because in my opinion, the pyramid of the person that practices the methodology of CrossFit and the pyramid of a CrossFit competitor are not the same pyramid.
Interesting.
So the pyramid and the boxes are the same, right? Nutrition at the bottom, obviously, you know, sleep, health, all those things are probably built into that first layer of nutrition as well. And then metabolic conditioning, and then gymnastics, weightlifting and throwing, and then sport. So they're the same layers, but they're not filled the same. What I mean by that is, and that was written out in the original, you know, CrossFit documents, the CrossFit Journal, first and second edition by Greg Glassman. The idea was build your fitness in the gym using the CrossFit methodology, explore vast or broad and modal domains at high intensity, and then go and explore sports outside. Go apply your fitness in different sports. This was kind of the basic framework, the basic philosophy. And this can still work really well if you're in that amateur kind of health-focused, health-biased CrossFit framework. But now if we switch to the competitors pyramid, the CrossFit, you know, the Metcons, the WODs, the tests, they're now at the top of the pyramid. This is your sport. This is what you compete in. And yes, it's broad, and yes, it's varied, and then it's constantly varied, but it is at the top of the pyramid. And what I see is that the metabolic conditioning has not been filled, right? We filled the gymnastics box because now we do our gymnastics progression, we do our strict work, we do our isolation work, weightlifting, we do our percentages, we do our partial lifts, We work on those technical aspects to build it up. We don't just go in and do a 1RM every time we do some weightlifting, although that's what they used to do, back in the day. But we know that it doesn't work like that, and you can't do it like this forever. So you have to build it a bit differently. And the conditioning, I feel like out of the three, if I had to pick, right, if there's weightlifting, gymnastics, and monostructural, which are the kind of the three big categories of CrossFit movements, I feel like, and I might be wrong, but I feel like the monostructural is a little bit behind in its development compared to the other two. We went to get the specialists in gymnastics. We went to get the specialists in weightlifting. And yes, there are endurance specialists, but most coaches aren't necessarily educated as much in those disciplines as they might be in the other ones, which means that you do your percentages in weightlifting, you do your strict work and your technical work in gymnastics, but then you just sit on a rower and you just pull like a madman, and that's as far as it goes. And then again, probably because of the mess that is exercise physiology and how complicated it is, and should we use percentages of heart rate max? Should we use a maximum aerobic power, maximum aerobic speed? What kind of zones do we use? Is it a three zone model, 5-zone model, 7-zone model? All those things confuse people, and rightly so. I don't like that it's so confusing. But then they don't know what to do, and they don't know who to listen to and what to follow. And so usually they either maybe don't do it optimally or don't do it at all. And for the competitor in CrossFit, well, again, his sport is the top of the pyramid, which means that the metabolic conditioning box is not the metcons that you do when you go hard in CrossFit. That cannot be, because that's already the top of your pyramid. So what ends up happening is that competitors end up just doing their sport all the time. And as we know, soccer players don't play games every single day. Marathon runners don't run marathons every single day. And if that's the only way that you practice for your sport, you're going to leave a lot of progress on the table. So I think I'm just trying to fill that metabolic conditioning second layer of the pyramid, especially for competitors, back in with some basic metabolic conditioning, which is not a metcon, contrary to what the word says, right?
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. Do you think that taking this this part of the pyramid serious, like for example, like Fraser joining the track team, or Kalipa and later Froning, like being coached by Hinshaw, I think they were the first athletes who really like focused on that.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that this created like this dominating athletes?
It's hard to say if that's what the differentiator was, but it was part of it, I think. And I mean, the event that
if you look at Kalipa, it was like obvious that was the switch which turned him to a serious competitor against Froning, like that year.
Absolutely.
I think it was 2014 or 15 or something.
Yeah, and I remember the story where he got hammered on a rowing workout the year before, and he said never again. And so he actually carried his rower in the back of his truck, and every single day he would be on the rower, and he'd be rowing and doing the work. And then he goes, I think the next year he goes to win that, was it 2,000 meters into a half marathon, and with the two scores, I think that was the one, and he destroys everybody, and people thought, oh, he's going to win the 2K and then he's going to explode. Actually, no, he had a strategy, and he implemented it perfectly, and he got there. And I think, if we think about endurance and we talk about gears, was it a couple of years ago there was that event? It was a mountain bike, just in a straight line on grass, and some rope climbs. Do you remember that one at the games?
Yeah, I think that was at the
it was
COVID
10
year.
rounds. Yeah, 10 rounds or something like that. And I remember second to last round, Fraser was in front, obviously, and he thought he was by himself, but he looks back and he sees somebody on his tail really close. And then you see,
I think that was Adler.
Yeah, that might have been. And I remember just seeing Matt going fifth gear. He was in fourth gear the whole time. And then he somehow he popped into fifth, and then he flew away. He literally just exploded away. And that's when I realized that this guy is probably never going all out unless he really needs to, unless he's, neck to neck with someone, and he has to go for the win. But there's always a margin, and that just speaks about his endurance and about his recovery capacity. And if we want to go there, then we can talk about that year where, and I forget the exact year, but Matt wins the Open, and he says, I shouldn't have been, I didn't want to
I shouldn't win.
win. I shouldn't have won the Open right now, because I don't want to be ready for the Open. I want to be ready for the games. And the way that I kind of picture this, and it's probably overly simplified, but it gets the point across. Matt doesn't do much CrossFit, or didn't do much CrossFit outside of the competitive season. So before February, before the Open, he didn't really do any CrossFit, quote unquote. He didn't do any Metcons. He did a lot of endurance work. He did a lot of strength and weightlifting work. He did a lot of gymnastics work. And then he just started piecing it all back together when the season started. But think about this. All he did was general stuff, right? If we think about, if we dissociate, if we break apart monostructural weightlifting, strength, gymnastics, and we don't put them together in a WOD, in a Metcon, we're just working on the pieces separately. And he was just doing this for months. And then he was still better than the rest of the world come February. And then he still had 5 months to do specific work, to do CrossFit work, and then destroy everybody at the games. And I think that's probably one aspect where most people can improve, is how they plan their competitive season. And a lot of what I see from a lot of athletes that are competitive, maybe not at the highest level, but that want to do well, that want to progress, and that are, rightly so, at a good level already, is that they maybe try to plan, between 5 and 10 competitions in the year. Every competition that you participate in is 2 weeks of training that you lose, quote unquote, because you have to taper the week before, and you have to recover the week after, whether it's physically, mentally, emotionally. You need that kind of 2-week period. So if you do 10 competitions a year, that's 20 weeks where you're not training, when you're not developing. And out of 52, that's a lot. That's 40% of the year where you're just testing yourself. And I think 40%, 40%. And so we have to think about, okay, do I need to, and some people need maybe the 8-10 competitions because maybe they're really good in the gym. Maybe they just can't compete. It's the nerves, it's the environment, it's the unknown. So maybe they need to practice that, and that's fair enough. But for those that have this down and then need to get better at the sport itself and develop their capacities, then maybe it's 2 competitions a year where you really want to peak in terms of 4, maybe 3, so you have 4-month cycles. You can kind of work into that. And maybe there's a couple other competitions. Maybe you do team if you're an individual, and we know that the team is a lot less intense and a lot less demanding than the individual. And just, I guess, being more thorough in your planning, so that there are times when you're obviously full on to CrossFit because you're getting ready for a competition, but there's other times of the year where you're building your endurance, you're building your strength, you're building all the stuff that is not CrossFit tests per se, but that will bring you what you need to get better at the sport when the time comes.
Yeah, I think Fraser was a master in that. I have one favorite interview. I think it was Willie George, and he was on a Nike promo tour with Fraser and some other people, and they ask him in an interview, what's the secret of Fraser, and he says, I don't know. He never trains. I'm always in a gym and he's not there. He's not training. And because it was early in the season and Fraser was not doing any CrossFit. So that was insane.
Yeah. And I think it looks weird for a lot of people. And in the current, at least as I see it, in the current CrossFit culture, doing something different than CrossFit and not being there and not throwing down, people are afraid of not doing it, right? Athletes say, well, I'm going to lose my fitness if I don't do CrossFit for 2 weeks off. What are you talking about? I can't do 2 weeks off. I'm going to, all my gains are going to go away. My 6-pack's going to go away. I'm going to put on a bit of weight. Well, maybe that's what your body needs. It's not what you want, right? But you cannot be fit all year round. If you're trying to be fit all year round and testing yourself every single week, guess what? You're probably at 80-85% tops of your actual potential. And this is why you see, extreme examples are, you take Olympic cycles for 4-year Olympic cycles for people that try to compete at the Olympics and want to win the Olympic gold. Year 1 and 2 of their Olympic cycle, they're useless in their sport, right? For the most part, the point is not to be fit all year round. The point is not to be fit in September if what you want is to compete in quarterfinals. The point is to be fit at the right time. And then for this, then you need to think backwards, plan accordingly, and then organize your training in a way that makes sense. And we know that, and that's true for CrossFit, but that's true for any other sport. Whatever you do, you're going to get better at, but then slowly there's going to be diminishing returns, right? And then the more you do, the less it brings you. And at some point, this is probably why you need to switch it up, because once you're doing so much, but it's only bringing you 0.5% a week because you've done so much of it for months, that's the time to switch, do something differently for a period of time. It's not a stop doing CrossFit forever. It's a think critically, and maybe there's an 8 or 12-week block where you can focus on fundamentals. You can go back to an empty bar. You can go back to PVC. I was talking with Caroline, Adler's partner and coach, a couple of weeks ago on the podcast, and she was saying, he's back to PVC now. And we go back to fundamentals and we work on those basics again. And he doesn't like it. But this is how every year starts after the games. They take a month off, a month and a half off. Now there's Rogue, so they're kind of starting CrossFit earlier than they would have liked to. That's just how the season is, and we talked about that with Caroline as well. But you have to switch it up. You can't just do the Metcons all year round, because again, it's going to work until it doesn't, and when it doesn't, it's usually not fun.
I think this is a huge problem in our sport, that you have you only have a few opportunities to make the financial part of the thing capitalize on that. You can earn a lot of money at only 3-4 events, and if you're not there, then your season is kind of fucked. And I think when I think about an athlete like Luka Jukic, for example, he didn't make the games, and then I felt like he was thinking, so okay, I feel like he's competing every other week since he didn't make it. So he was competing in, I don't know, 20 throwdowns and winning most of them, but he's only competing. I feel he's more competing than he's training. So I think that's a huge problem, that you only have certain big events to make some cash, and if you're not there, then you kind of have to throw out of the window your plan for the entire year.
Yeah, and that's especially hard for, like you said, those elites that are there and that can compete for that prize money.
Yeah.
And we have to be real, most people are not there, right? The vast majority of competitors, they're not at that elite professional level. They don't have sponsor contracts that enable them to just train, every day and make that their life. And it's still, the sport is still very young, and sponsors are obviously in the sport a lot, but already, but there's still so much to go if we compare it to other professional sports. So obviously now it's really just the top 10, top 20 that can live off of the sport year round, and others are either skimming by, or it's not easy. It's not easy. And that was definitely from what I gathered talking to Caroline, it was definitely one aspect that they weren't super happy about. It's how the season is laid out currently, and what that means for the athletes. When is the off season? There's not really an off season, because even now there's Rogue coming up, and people that got invited or are going there or need to go there because they try to make a buck, they don't really have an off season. So then how do you plan for that?
There's only an off season if you want it to be an off season.
And I think if you have the confidence that this is going to help you, right? I've seen younger athletes that are very, very talented and very good in the sport already, but it's hard to say no. When somebody calls you up and says, "I'm inviting you to that throwdown," and it's maybe the biggest one in the country that you're in, or the neighboring country, well, it takes a lot to say no to that. And the sacrifice of not going and of not being there, and the opportunities and the people you're going to meet, and then you're probably going to do good because you're good at the sport already. But it takes, I think, a lot of confidence in the coach, and for the coach to know and say, you know what, no, this you're going to do, but this you're not going to do, because we want to be ready for then. And if we do all of them, then you're just going to be in pieces at the end of the season. And I think it's definitely a process that you have to test out, and that you have to learn from. And we started doing this year with Claudia. So after the semifinals, she obviously didn't get the result that she wanted, which was to go to the games. We took 3 months of virtually no CrossFit, right? She needs to gain some weight, put on some muscle mass, because she's still a little light compared to her female competitors, and she needs to run. And those are kind of her two axes of progression. So this is what we did for 3 months. She did a lot of running and a lot of strength work, and she now, a couple weeks back, started including more CrossFit again. And it was the first time that we really dissociated things and did a solid block of time with no CrossFit or very, very little CrossFit. And yeah, she felt like shit in the middle of it, because she wasn't doing any CrossFit. So then she did I think it was the Rogue qualifiers, which were very hard. And she hadn't done much CrossFit, and she got, hammered by those workouts. And again, rightly so, because she wasn't in peak form for CrossFit at that moment. But now she's been back for 3 or 4 weeks. She did a team competition in Madrid, and I think they got second place behind Chandler Smith and Noah Olson's team. She did really well, and now she's back into it, and she's feeling great and better than before. But it took those 3 months, and there was some doubts, right? Is it going to work? Am I going to come back to my level? Is this what I need? And Guillaume, another French competitor that I've been chatting with quite a bit, we did a test together this summer, and then he did essentially kind of a triathlon focused plus strength on the side for 2 months, 3 months. Same thing, right? It's new. So it's, you don't know what you're going into. How is your body going to react? How many weeks do you need to get back to your top CrossFit level if you've got a competition coming up? But if you don't try, you don't know. And so people need to kind of venture out of this. I'm doing CrossFit every week, and that's all I do because I'm afraid to lose my fitness. And, start in small chunks. Start for a month. Do something a little bit different than pure CrossFit for a month, and then come back to CrossFit. See how the transition goes. See what you learned in the process. Then do 2 months. Then do 3 months. And obviously it depends on your level and what you're trying to achieve and what you need and what your weaknesses are. But we have to branch out of this. Every week looks the exact same all year round, because if you want to get to the next level, this is probably not how you should operate.
Yeah, man. Claudia is one of my favorite persons on the podcast. She's so fun.
She's awesome. She's just a ray of sunshine. She's so happy, so positive all the time, and so hardworking. She goes to bed early. She eats her meals. She does her recovery. She does her training hard, and she's really dedicated, and she's patient, and she's putting in the work. And it's really great to see someone who's so dedicated to getting to the top. And she'll she trusts her team. She trusts Luke, who's her main programmer, and kind of has the Mjolnir program, and that's what she follows. And then I come in with the conditioning, and then Max, my friend, works with her on her running, and then Basile, her boyfriend, also helps with all the injury prevention and all those kind of little things on the side. But she does it all, and she does it well, and she trusts the process. And it's really fun to work with someone like that.
Man, my brain is going into some different directions. But that being said, do you know that it works, or are you a little bit afraid too?
No, I know that it works, but obviously knowing that it works and knowing exactly how to apply it for different people are two slightly different things. So I know on paper, on principle, it works, but then you also have to put it together the right way, right? You have to mix it all together and make the perfect sauce in order for it to work. So I'm not afraid. I also know that I can make mistakes, as we all can. And I think that's probably something that us as coaches, if I may talk for the coaches at large, we probably, and obviously speaking for myself here, we probably don't take enough responsibility for our work and then the program, right? Because if it works, it's the athlete, and if it doesn't work, well, they didn't do it properly, or they didn't follow the plan. Well, maybe your plan was shit. Maybe my plan was shit. And so we have to be okay with that. And we have to learn from our mistakes. One thing that I do a lot more now than I used to do in the past is communication, is asking for the athlete's feedback, is programming something, but then saying, what do you think about this? Because I know what I want out of the session, but she knows herself better than I do. And so she's going to be able to tell me, oh no, that's probably, you know what, we probably should take a 17 kg dumbbell instead of a 22 on this set, or you know what, the 50 cals on the echo is probably going to be that much time, so maybe we do 60 this time because this is kind of the target. And so I think there's a lot more back and forth, which makes it more of a collaboration, which I think is what it should be, right, in terms of planning, right? It's easy to write something, but I know from my personal training years, you write something on the paper, you write something for the session, it never goes exactly as you planned. There's always some little thing that you're going to change. You do a set more, you do a set less, a rep more, a rep less. And it's the same here. So you have to obviously do the best that you can in the planning, but then be very flexible because we're going to make mistakes. She's going to be in better shape some days than others. We have to adjust. So no, I know that it works, and I've seen it enough in both my practice and other people and what they do. But then it's finding that right balance for that person at that moment, based on their goals, based on their needs, and that's coaching.
Interesting. Yeah, the other direction I was thinking, and this is something, I don't know if it annoys me or if it's just not correct, but I think I first heard this like in an interview of Ben Bergeron, like way back in the days when he was asked what takes the most amount to build, like strength, conditioning, and whatever, and he was saying that like basically it takes years to build strength, but it only like takes months to build the conditioning. Is conditioning or endurance still the low-hanging fruit, or is this just wrong?
I think it depends on who we're talking about, right? Because different athletes have different needs, have different sporting backgrounds too. Somebody coming from triathlon might not need as much endurance work as somebody who came from powerlifting or from a very short, intense sport like American football, for example. So that's the first thing we have to contextualize based on the person. I don't know, and I haven't heard that said directly from Ben. I don't know if I would agree that it only takes months to build endurance. You know, you talk to any endurance athlete, and they'll tell you that to get to the top of their sport, it's going to take 10 to 15 years because it takes that amount of time to build that endurance to the point where you can win. I was fortunate enough at the beginning of the year to do a training camp with Sam Laidlow, the French triathlete, who recently won the Ironman World Championship. He's only 24, and he's the youngest person to ever win a world championship. And before that, people thought to win an Ironman, it's an 8-hour event, right? You're competing for 8 hours straight. People thought, you know what, you can't be at the top of the pyramid, at the top of your sport, unless you're in your late 20s, early 30s, because it takes that long to build. Sam's probably an anomaly in that he started when he was 4. And so he's been doing triathlon for 20 years. He did other things in his younger years as well. But he's been in there for 2 decades. So I agree that, it takes years to build strength, but it also takes years to build endurance. And I think it also depends what type of endurance we're talking about, because the high intensity stuff, we can definitely build it pretty quickly. And after a couple seasons of really, focused, dedicated work, you've probably maximized that potential there if you're only working on the high intensity side of things. But then there's kind of that in between intensity that people call, tempo threshold, kind of 6, 7 out of 10 in terms of intensity, and longer durations, 30, 60, 90 minutes. And then the very long, very easy stuff, which we talked about in the beginning, zone 2 type stuff, which is very easy, 2, 3, 4 out of 10 maybe, and you can span that for an hour, 2 hours, or 6 hours. So the top of the pyramid, you can definitely develop it faster than the base and the middle part, and you'll actually hear that even from pro cyclists, that have been in the game for years and years. They'll tell you that their VO2 max, which we can equate to your capacity at high intensity to make things very simple. And yes, there's other parts that play, but let's take VO2 max as an illustration of your high intensity capacity. They've maxed that out probably in their junior years or just after transitioning to senior cycling, but it hasn't moved in years. They're not pushing their VO2 max up and up and up every year after they've already done 5-10 years at a high level. Their threshold, if we can qualify that as the intensity you can hold for 40 to 60 minutes, that builds still a little bit, but they've kind of maxed, they're close to tapping out after 10-15 years. And what they all say, and what you find across sports, whether it's cycling, whether it's long distance running, is that the base of the pyramid, the fundament, the endurance, right? That you can still build over a career. And at that point, I don't think we found the limit of it yet. to the point where you see the Norwegians in triathlon, they're not limited by the number of hours that they train. They're limited by the calories they can ingest. So they're to the point now where they're testing different foods to see how fast and how well they can absorb it, because that's their limiting factor, right? Olav, their coach that I was lucky enough to have on the podcast, he doesn't think in hours, he thinks in calories when it comes to training. this this is the limiting factor, because you can always do more work, but then can you recover from it, and can you fuel for it? So if we push it to the, and obviously those are extremes, right? And we don't necessarily need to go to that extent in a sport like CrossFit, but we need to know where the limits are. And I think that the high intensity, we can achieve our highest potential in that pretty quickly. But then the medium and low intensity, this is what we can still develop for years and years.
Interesting. If you explain like that, I see it in like certain athletes. Like if you take, for example, I had Bronislav Olenkowicz on the show, and he's obviously like one of the strongest guys out there, but he's also very good in like short workouts, like explosive things, even if there's like, I don't know, like a 400 meter in it or something. He's very good at this, but he starts sucking at the long distance stuff. If you take him on a 5K, he's toast. But that's really interesting when you explain it like that.
I think you can take that endurance to powerful spectrum for different athletes, and you can quite easily place them if you know them, or if you work with them, or if you've seen them compete. You kind of know, like you said, where they're strong, right? Is he better at the 1 to 3 minute time domain, or is he better on the 20 to 40 minute time domain? And those are usually going to be quite different athletes in how they're built, and again, their strength and their weaknesses. So what I try to do when I work with CrossFit athletes is essentially just fill the gap. So if I have somebody who's really endurant, well, guess what? We're going to do some high intensity, some really high intensity that you've probably never done because you're not good at it. And inversely, if you have somebody really powerful, like the profile you just described, and you're really good at 3 minutes, but then you fall apart after 10, well, guess what? We're going to do some longer stuff, because this is what you need to get better. And contrary to what people think, training slow does not make you slow. It only makes you slow if that's all you do, right? If you stop everything powerful, explosive, and fast, and you do only slow stuff, guess what? After a year, you're going to be slow, and you're not going to be able to replicate those high intensity efforts, or those peak watts, or those heavy bars. But if you find a way to balance all those things out, and you keep some explosive work, you keep some speed work, and you build the base of the endurance pyramid, then you can have it all, essentially. Which was the argument of CrossFit in the beginning. You can be endurant and strong and fast. You can mix all of those, and we see it in the top athletes, right? They are endurant, and they are strong, and they are fast. They have all those qualities. So again, we just have to think in blocks, and think in 1 month, 2 month, 3 month, 4 month period, and say, okay, do I have a big deficiency in my endurance? Well, maybe it's worth doing 8 to 12 weeks of focused work on that while I maintain my lift and maintain my strength and maintain my speed. And then when I get back to it, and I work on my strengths again, now I'm enhanced because I can recover from it better. And the number of people that I've seen now do that endurance work and come back to me and say, I can rep more squats, even though I didn't do an endurance squat cycle or anything like that. So muscular endurance and resistance is going up. Even people saying my gymnastic endurance is better from doing that endurance work, because the qualities you build on a bike or running, general qualities, will transfer to everything. And I think that's another important aspect where we kind of lost the plot at some point. We're very much in the all specific all the time right now. And I often hear the argument of, if it doesn't look like my sport, I don't want to do it because it's not going to help me. So people are just focusing on things that are exactly like their sport. And when you're close to a competition, when you're trying to push the needle on the sport, yes, you have to be specific and you have to practice the sport itself. But then when you're far away from competitions, when you're trying to work on your weaknesses, well, guess what? You got to go outside of your sport and do things that are completely different. And again, a bike, you don't see biking a lot. You see biking more in the games than in any local competition, right? Yet working on the bike develops the heart, develops your muscles, develops all the cardiovascular functions. And this will help regardless of what you do, whether you're doing gymnastics or weightlifting afterwards. It's going to help you because those general qualities intrinsically transfer to the specific.
Interesting. What do you think is the most like underused machine in the CrossFit space?
I think the bike, and I'm
The
very
bike.
biased. I'm very biased towards the bike. I'll admit it. But I have some arguments. I think that the bike allows you to accumulate a substantial amount of volume with very little impact on your
Impact, yeah.
body. And for somebody doing weightlifting multiple times a year, heavy strength work, people are usually heavy in CrossFit. If we think about, muscle mass, and yes, running is a great way to develop your endurance as well. But I think the entry cost to running is a lot higher than people think. And I've seen enough CrossFitters now say, "Oh, I'm bad at running. I'm just going to start running 3 times a week." And then 2 weeks later, their legs are screaming and they can't walk anymore because their anterior, their tibias are just fried. And they have shin splints and they have to stop for a month because they can't do it anymore. So I think we don't appreciate the cost of entry to running and to accumulating high amounts of volumes in running. It can be done. It should be done, but it's usually not done or progressed properly. So I think for me, if I had to pick two, it would be the run and the bike. But counting that the run has a higher cost of entry, or we just have to be a lot more careful in our progression. Whereas the bike, you can probably add a couple hours on the bike this week, and then in a month you can go to 2.5 hours, 3 hours per week. It's not going to do much. It's not going to impact you much if as long as you eat enough, as long as obviously it's well balanced in terms of intensity with everything else that you're doing. So in the context of a balanced training program, the bike is virtually costless. And it allows you to work on those kind of deep qualities without impacting your joints, without impacting the rest. There's no technical component to the bike, or very little, compared to a rower, compared to those other training modalities. And I do see that as an advantage, especially if you're trying to spend more time and accumulate low intensity time on the machine. It's a lot easier to do on a bike than to do on a row. At row, you have to keep your posture, you have to row properly. And I think there's a huge difference. Again, I'll go to an extreme example to illustrate the point. I have a friend, Vincent. He's a French champion in the 500 meter in the masters category on the rower, on the indoor rower. So the only time he trains on the rower is once a week for his sprints on the Monday. This is his only rowing workout of the week. He's a high level rower, right? This is the only rowing workout he does. He does about 8 hours of low intensity work per week, mixing between bike erg and an echo. He does a bunch of tempo threshold work on the ski and on the bike as well. And on the echo bike, he does a lot of strength work. He's pretty short for an indoor rower, so he has to kind of compensate with crazy strength. He does about 5 hours of injury prevention mobility work per week. But he only does one rowing session per week. And obviously, if you're at the beginning and you're not good technically, you would have to spend more time. But he is of the opinion that obviously when you have to push, 700 watts or whatever it is for just over a minute, rowing for an hour at 150 watts doesn't look anything like what you're going to have to do to compete. So yes, rowing would be more specific, but in his case, in his specific extreme case, it's detrimental to do all of his low intensity work on the rower, because if he gets used to rowing at 150 watts, well, the 700 is not going to be the same after. So that's another argument that I see for the bike. Another argument is that most people haven't really practiced on the bike. So obviously the best stimulus is the one you've never had. And you're going to have a bigger margin of progression when you train on a tool that you haven't really used. So I'd say those are probably the main arguments: is the lack of structural load from the bike, the low technical aspect of the bike compared to other modalities. I guess another one that I also see as an argument for the bike versus an echo or an assault bike is that the load on the heart is going to be lower. What I mean by that is when you're on an echo or any fan bike, it's a whole body movement. So you're going to be recruiting and using a lot of muscle mass, which means your heart's going to have to work really hard to bring that blood everywhere. And what I see in literally all the CrossFitters that I see, and I'll say 99 to not be absolute, but in 99% of the CrossFitters that I've tested on the bike, virtually none of them are limited by their heart. their heart is fine. Their heart is really strong. It can beat really, really fast and really, really high. It's their legs that limit them usually. And by working on the bike, you can really isolate the legs and just work on that aspect. And yes, that means you need to slow down because you're probably shit at it at first. But it also means that, again, you're going to progress really fast. And the development and the progressions that I see using the bike on everything else that they do is quite tremendous. And that's true for CrossFitters, and that's true for soccer players, and that's true for any sports people that I work with. When they apply those ideas on the bike, regardless of what sport they do, the transfer is really good in terms of endurance, in terms of recovery, in terms of resistance to high intensity. All those things become better because they did that work. And so, yeah, you could do it on the bike, you could do it on the run. But if you do it on the run, you have to be intelligent about how you progress it.
Yeah. I think in general, like at the general public, that's always the first thing to do. Oh, I wanna get fitter. I'm gonna start running.
Yeah. And for good reason. We're built to run.
Yeah.
You know, but again, if you're 90 kgs and you're a dude and you're, 12% body fat, so you've got quite a bit of muscle mass on you, and you don't have a background in running or in rugby or a field sport where you ran a lot, and you try to jump into running, and we had
There's
that
a
situation.
lot of technique in it.
There is, and there's the prerequisites, right? Are your feet strong enough? Are your ankles strong enough? Because guess what? If they're not, it's your shins and your knees and your hips that are going to take all of it. And we saw it in the beginning when, and now he's working with Matt and HWPO, but Victor, when we started working together in March after the quarterfinals, he's a gymnast initially at its foundation. He's a gymnast when he was a kid. So gymnastics, we saw how good he is, and how much he has already on the field at his young age in gymnastics, and his strength numbers are getting way up there now. And is really starting to compete with guys that are, a few kilos heavier than him in body weight. His running, though, is still something where he needs quite a bit of work. And this is why we started working with Max, my friend and colleague, that is a specialist in running here in Switzerland. And we had to take it really slow at the beginning, right? Because otherwise his shins would hurt. And we don't want an athlete to be in pain all the time. We want them to, get better, get over that limitation, and then be able to push. So I'm definitely not trying to discourage people to run. I would encourage people to run, but I would encourage people to run intelligently and not just jump into 3 days of running because that's what you saw you had to do on the training plan when you haven't run at all in 2 years or very little.
Yeah.
Because you are going to run into some problems.
Start with a marathon. No.
Right. I want to run a marathon. Okay.
Man,
can we start with the 5K?
Man, I'm always asking like my followers if they have specific questions for the guests. And it's interesting because usually it's like some, I don't know, what's your favorite color? What's your max snatch or whatever? What's your favorite meal or something? But I have this guy and he's really into like conditioning stuff. And
Okay.
he asked some really interesting questions. I don't know if we dig into a rabbit hole now, but
I'm excited.
I don't know how to translate it really. He's really into I don't know if the English word is the English words hypoxia training.
Hypoxic, yeah.
Hypoxic, yeah. And he's asking if how you see hypoxia training and if it can has a positive influence on the endurance and also concentration and building strength.
Okay, so I think I don't know if you have more details from him on what he means by hypoxic training, because I think there's different ways of seeing it, right? Some people qualify, for example, Wim Hof method or Wim Hof protocols as hypoxic training, which I would not. The reason being, and I'm going to be kind of picky on words here, but I do think it's important if we want to have a conversation on those topics. Hypoxia is when the oxygen is lower in your surrounding environment, right? That's hypoxia. And hyperoxia would be when you have artificially more oxygen in your environment and the air that you breathe. Hypoxemia is when you desaturate your oxygen inside your blood. So usually, if you put one of those little things on your finger at the hospital to look at your saturation, you're going to be between, unless you have some kind of lung disease or some limitations there, you're going to be between 98 and 99% usually, which means that out of 100 units of, let's call it hemoglobin, which is the little taxi that carries the oxygen from your lungs to your muscles and to your organs, out of 100 little taxis, there's 99 that are filled with oxygen, and there's just one that isn't. That's a perfectly normal saturation level at rest. And what you can do with certain protocols like Wim Hof is induce what's called hypoxemia, which means that you're going to lower that saturation inside the blood. So you might drop it, below 90 to 80. And this is one of the reasons why you want to be sitting or lying down when you're doing those things. Never do it when you're driving, never do it in water, never do it even when standing, because you can pass out. So there is a cost or some, at least, safety measures that we have to just respect in that regard. And so if we talk about those methods, it's different than thinking about, for example, a hypoxic chamber. Some gyms have it now, or some specialized centers have it usually, where you're going to be able to artificially essentially increase the altitude equivalent that you would be at. So maybe you're training at 3,000 meters elevation today, which means
but you're really at sea level.
You're at sea level, but inside the room, instead of having 21% of oxygen, you maybe have 19 or 17. And what that means is that your body has to work harder to get the oxygen from the lungs to the muscles. And from what I've read on this, there's different adaptations mostly depending on where you come from, your origins. And in the paper that I have in mind, they were talking about people that come from more of Tibet, Himalayan area, and how they adapt to altitude. And then there was the adaptations that you see from, for example, Kenyans on the high plateau in Africa. And the adaptations that you see from those populations are not exactly the same. Some, and if I remember correctly, if you look at the people that come from more the Himalayas and that area, what you're going to see is an increased capillary density. Capillaries are the little things that essentially allow you to transfer oxygen from your lungs into your blood, and then from your blood into your muscles. It's kind of that interface. So if we continue with the cab analogy for transport of oxygen inside the blood, we could say that it's the parking spots where the taxi or the cab stops to unload the oxygen, to unload its passengers, or to load them up at the lung, if we think like that. Whereas the Kenyans, they seem to increase their hemoglobin mass more as an adaptation to altitude, meaning there's more cabs, there's more taxis in the blood, and they can transport more oxygens. So there's different adaptations there, but they are all beneficial to performance. That much we know, and this is why endurance athletes, they usually, if they are at that level and they have let's say the luxury to go do an altitude camp, they're going to do it, right? The Norwegian triathlete, they spend I wouldn't say a good part of the year, but there's multiple weeks every year that they spend at altitude, because that's a great way to increase that hemoglobin mass and help you carry more oxygen. Now what is being found, or I'll come to that after, but to answer directly the question, yes, it does have a benefit to performance, but there's also a drawback to hypoxia, meaning that you can't push as much in terms of intensity. So when you go at altitude, you're going to win on that endurance side of things, on that oxygen transport side of things. But because you're at altitude, because there's a higher cost to work when you're at a higher altitude, you just can't do as much or as hard. So it's kind of that balancing act of going at altitude at the right time, but then coming back and kind of maxing out again on your high intensity stuff before your competition, so you're ready. And obviously, depending on your event, that is very different. If you're competing in an 8-hour Ironman, you don't need the intensity as much as someone who's going to be doing, a 2,000 meter row test. Because rowers go to altitude, runners go to altitude, cyclists go, all those people go. So I do think that it's a net positive, but it's also an extra stress on the body. So we have to be smart about, again, how we plan it, how we include it in the training, and how we recover from it.
So you have to be smart when you're gonna do it and for how long.
Exactly. And what I'm starting to look into now which seems to be at least as interesting as altitude, if not more than altitude, is heat training. And that's something that we're going to, again, do a trial run, do a test with Claudia leading up to Dubai. And I've got some other athletes that I follow one-on-one. They're sailors, and they do, what do we call it, the grinder, but it's essentially an arm crank or an arm ergometer. So they cycle, but with their arms. And that's what they do on the boat. And it turns out that they have a competition in Dubai the same weekend as the Dubai Championships. So we'll be doing the heat protocol with Claudia. We'll be doing the heat protocol with those guys as well, to test and see how can we improve, tolerance to heat and performance in hot environments, especially when it's December here and it's cold, and now you're flying to Dubai and it's 27 or 30.
Yeah.
And it seems like the adaptations from heat, they're a little bit different, but they're just as beneficial as altitude. And you have to be smart again and careful and plan it well. Actually have a call on Monday with a colleague, Cyril, who's a performance specialist here in France and who works with a lot of endurance athletes, people that go to the Tour de France, that kind of caliber. And he does a lot of altitude and a lot of heat training with those people. And what he said is, yes, it's very potent. Yes, it works really well, but you have to plan it smart. You have to rehydrate properly, because you can really do some damage as well if you just say, oh, I'm just going to do again, I'm being a little bit cynical here, but if you say, oh, I'm just going to do my workout every day in the sauna for a week, well, guess what? That's not how you're going to maximize your adaptations.
Yeah.
You might do some damage along the way. So those are the kind of things that are probably still a bit on the fringes, right? They're the kind of marginal gains for most people that are not training full time yet. So I'd say that most people shouldn't worry too much about those training modalities unless you're at the point where this is kind of the next step. But people like shiny objects, people like new stuff, people like to do fancy stuff, when really the fancy stuff they should be doing is sleeping 1 hour more a night and then getting off the phone earlier. And I mean, I say this and I'm the same, right? I'll get stuck on my phone at night sometimes, but I know how much better I feel if I go to bed early. I know how much better I feel if I sleep well, if I take care of this and nutrition and stress management. So I'd say most people should focus on this, but for some people, it might be worth investigating hypoxic training, heat training. But again, with the people that know how to do it, with the right recovery parameters, with the right safeguards in place, so we don't do damage, because again, we can do damage. So I think that it's a very interesting field, and I'm just starting to learn about it.
Yeah, man. Interesting. Yeah. Same guy asked another question. Maybe this is like a cap to your programming or your page. He asked if there are like specific training protocols for CrossFitters for endurance and conditioning.
Specific. There's many ways to get there. I have built some training plans around that, but they're not the only ones. And what I've seen work the best is, if we talk about training zones and intensities, it's a program that's kind of based. It's called Endure, but it's based around zone 2, 3, 4 kind of intensities. So essentially everything that has not really worked in CrossFit per se. If we think of CrossFit as a high intensity sport in the way that it's practiced and competed in, high intensity would be anything from very short sprint all the way to maybe 20 minutes, 25 minutes in duration, which would be, 97, 99% of Metcons fall in that time window. So we could essentially say that CrossFit lives, and technically in exercise physiology, we would call that the severe intensity domain, which means you're above your second threshold. Some people still call it anaerobic threshold, but you're essentially in the area where your body is on its savings account, right? If we think about energetics, we can use a bank analogy, which works quite well. If you go all the way up to your second threshold, you're still in your checking account. So as long as the salary is coming in, you can spend it, right? And so that's the oxygen you can bring in. And essentially your second threshold is the point where the oxygen you're bringing in is not sufficient anymore compared to what you're trying to pull out or what you're needing to utilize to produce the mechanical work. And so once you go above that checking account, now you're going into the savings account. And that savings account is just some money that you put aside. And we could use the kind of endurance to powerful spectrum in terms of profiles of athletes that we discussed before. And we could say that somebody who's muscular, powerful, will have a bigger savings account than somebody who's pretty thin and is more geared towards long endurance stuff. And this is just how we're built. I'll leave the details aside for now. But essentially, once you go above that second threshold, now you're in the severe domain, and now you're drawing on that savings account. So this is kind of where CrossFit is all the time. And so what I've seen work really well is actually going below, right? Going at lower intensities. So sticking between let's call it 3 to 7 out of 10. If we think of 10 degrees of intensity or of difficulty or perceived exertion, I like to use RP quite a bit. Somewhere between 2 and 7 is usually where we don't spend time. And this is one of the main reasons why it's going to help CrossFitters, is because they just don't train there usually. And when do you see an hour long either EMOM, or even if it's broken up into 3 times 20 minutes at 6 out of 10 effort, right? It doesn't usually happen. And if it does, it's here and there, but it's really not a focus thing. So I think by focusing on those intensities for 6, 8, 10, 12 weeks, you can really move the needle. And then when you go back to focusing on high intensity in your sport, you're really going to feel the difference there.
Would you like implement this into the normal CrossFit training, or would you just focus on this specific thing
I think
for
you can do
like 6 to 8 weeks?
I think you can do both. If you can do both, and what I do in the program is I have what I call an integration guide, where I recommend people, for example, don't do 4 or 5 metcons a week on top of the program, because that's probably not that's maybe how you're used to training, but that's not how you're going to get the most out of this endurance program. So I usually tell people to maybe go down to 1 hard metcon a week if they want to just keep a little bit of it going. Keep doing your strength work, keep doing your weightlifting, keep doing your gymnastics, work on those fundamentals, but focus for a little bit on that endurance. And then once the cycle is over, then you can go back to what you were doing before. And I think that's also one thing I'm trying to bring is have that back and forth, right? For a period of time, we work on fundamentals, and for some that might be the strength that needs the most focus. For some, it might be the conditioning, but then we go back to the sport, and then we train intensely, and we try to maximize our potential there. But then we come back, and it's this back and forth, which is essentially just programming and periodization. That is necessary if we want to keep progressing forward. We can't just do the same training all year round and expect it to work forever.
Yeah. Man, that was really interesting. The entire talk. Thank you, man.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. I speak about those things a lot in French. I don't have as many opportunities to do so in English.
Yeah, that's sad, man. I was like scrolling through your YouTube channel and like soaking in every English episode, but I was like, what is that all that French means? I'm so interested in this.
yeah. I'm sorry for people that, follow the channel and want more English content. I just don't have enough time right now. And I would love, I'm striving to be in a place where I can just spend my time creating French and English content. Because really, if I come down to it, I love that process of trying to synthesize, simplify information, and then share it. That's really something that I absolutely love doing. And if I could do only that, I would do only that. I'm not there yet, but I'm working hard so that one day I can, push out 1 or 2 podcasts a week, one in French, one in English, do more content in English. So I'm sorry for everybody out there that would like more English content. I'm trying.
Yeah, man. When is Dubai? When are you leaving?
Oh, I'm not going. Claudia's going.
You're not going.
It's the first week of December. I think she's taking the plane on the 6th, if I'm not mistaken. And I think it starts on the 6th or the 8th. It's somewhere in there. So it's beginning of December.
Interesting. I'm excited for that.
Yeah, me too. It's going to be nice to see.
Awesome, man. I'm gonna stop the recording. Where is the